السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته.
وعليكم السلام.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على أشرف الأنبياء والمرسلين نبينا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. رب اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقهوا قولي. First of all, I'd like to thank Brother Adam and the other brothers, mashallah, who've been very kind and hospitable, and they've invited me all the way here from Birmingham. And I'm a little bit familiar with Middlesbrough because my brother in the late 90s and the early 2000s, he used to actually study in Teesside University. And my family, we knew, we had family friends here in Middlesbrough, as I'm sure our brother knows as well, a good friend of mine, our family. And his name was Uncle Hussein, one of the Prophet Hussein, rahimahullah, may Allah have mercy on him. And so my brother, when he used to study here, we used to come, we used to visit. I've been maybe 3 or 4 times. It's a long time, it's been a while since I came. I've just come once before for a talk, maybe a few years ago now, before COVID. So anyway, we used to come, and Uncle Hussein was very, I'm sure those of you who know, Uncle Hussein rahimahullah was very hospitable. So he was very hospitable, always generous with his time, with his, with his hospitality, mashallah. And I remember, subhanAllah, I must have been maybe 10, 11, 12 years old. I still remember to this day, and this is a sign of how when someone is hospitable and when they're a good host, it's something you never forget, it's something you always remember. And I remember every time we used to leave, he used to have some pizza shops that were owned by his son-in-laws and relatives. He used to give us like 4 or 5 boxes. And there used to be maybe 4 or 5 of us in the car, like coming from Birmingham. It wasn't like there were loads of us. But just out of generosity, he would give us like 4 or 5 boxes of pizzas, mashallah. And they were the best pizzas I ever had, mashallah. Maybe because of where they were coming from. And the pizzas were very well known, mashallah. And one of the brothers used to live here. The same year I got accepted in Medina University, he was making hijrah to Mecca. His name was Brother Aswar. And he was Uncle Hussein's son-in-law, if I'm not mistaken. Son-in-law, yeah?
Not quite.
Yeah, like a relative of Uncle Hussein. And so we went at the same time. So I used to study in Medina and he used to be in Mecca, and he opened a pizza shop in Mecca. It was called Amigos. So every time I used to go to Mecca, I used to always visit him. So mashallah, alhamdulillah, it's nice to be back. Some nice links here. It's good to see some of the old faces and some beautiful new faces as well, mashallah. So the topic of today is obstacles in the way of marriage. Obstacles in the way of marriage. And as we know, there are many factors today that cause these obstacles to exist. From them is being in a non-Muslim country and the obstacles that come about as a result of this. Another reason is cultural, and we'll go into detail about these inshallah. A person may be from a certain background, there might be certain habits, customs from that culture or from that place where he may be from back home, that's maybe preventing him from marrying or marrying someone specific, whereas in Islam there may not be any specific issues or reasons for him not to marry. And so you have these issues that arise. And also one of the other issues which causes obstacles in the way of marriage is that temptations are a lot more and more prevalent than they used to be. And this is based on a hadith where the Prophet ﷺ prophesies that this would be the case. That zina, he said, from the signs of the Day of Judgment, وَيُكْثَرُ zina, that zina will become widespread. Zina will become more prevalent. Haram relationships will become more common, more prevalent in society. And so this is something we see today. And this also adds to the hardship of marriage. Because as the Messenger of Allah ﷺ also told us, that from the temptations of this world, these very temptations that we have that cause us to commit sin, these are the same temptations that surround paradise. He said, that paradise paradise is surrounded by temptations, by hardships. So any hardships or temptations a person is going to fall into, those are the things which surround hellfire. So temptations are the things that surround hellfire. So when a person does something that's from his desires, those things which are haram, that are easy to do, and it's something that a person can fall into easily, they are from those things which surround hellfire, and so it's easy for a person to fall into hellfire as a result of those temptations. And he said about paradise, حُفَّتِ الْجَنَّةُ بِالْمَكَارِهِ, that paradise is surrounded, paradise as opposed to Jannah, as opposed to hellfire, paradise is surrounded by things which are difficult for a person to do. They're hard for a person to do. Whereas hellfire is surrounded by things which are desirous for the soul. A person wants to do them. Their lusts, their desires, their things which a person feels like are attractive in this world. The things which surround Jannah are those things which are hard. Those things which a person doesn't necessarily want to do. Waking up at 4 or 5 o'clock in the morning, to form Fajr. Waking up for Tahajjud, fasting, in the heat of Ramadan, in these seasons that we have in these years. These are things which are challenging, praying 5 times a day, giving zakah, etc., etc. These are things which a person, naturally, it may not be something which initially, because of his weakness in Iman, it's not something which he wants to do, unless Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala blesses him with that Iman and that love for the deen. And so, there are many of these obstacles. And as I mentioned, zina is also something which is a reason for people doing things in the un-Islamic way. And as I said, because it's easier for a person to do, a person has more chance of doing those things because he feels like marriage in Islam is something complicated. He thinks it's something hard. He thinks it's something which is maybe far away or difficult to attain. He thinks that marriage in Islam isn't going to be something which is easy. There's too many, there's too much red tape. There's too many obstacles. There's too much politics going on, family politics, and so he decides it's not for me, and so he ends up doing things in the haram way. And so we have to look at this from two perspectives, as parents, and also as young people who want to get married. And as parents, I think we have to understand that the times that we live in today maybe aren't the times that we used to live in the past. Maybe 20, 30, 40 years ago, maybe even 10 years ago, especially with the rise of LGBTQ, etc. Things have changed a lot in terms of sexuality, in terms of, as I mentioned in the hadith about zina being prevalent, it's common, in TV shows, books, and films, etc. It's something which is just, it's almost accepted. And so when you live in a society where something so dangerous and something haram is just accepted in society, and we're products of our society living in this country, it's also going to affect us, or it's going to affect our children. And so we have to understand that the times that maybe we lived in and the times we grew up isn't the same as the times and the places that our children are growing up. And they're living under different circumstances. And maybe when we married, it was done more in a different way, and maybe we were older, and maybe we didn't feel like it was necessarily a danger to us if we didn't get married. Maybe we didn't expect, or we didn't think it was a risk of us committing zina if we didn't get married. Nowadays, of course, the situation is very different. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in the Quran, He in fact encourages us, even commands us to marry off those people that we're responsible for who are single. Allah says, وَأَنْكِحُ الْأَيَامَ مِنْكُمْ. He says, marry off the free singles amongst you. Marry them off. If you're responsible for them, then marry them off. وَالصَّالِحِينَ مِنْ عِبَادِكُمْ وَإِمَائِكُمْ. And the righteous from your male and female slaves. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala even goes as far as saying, even the slaves which you may own, you should be marrying them off as well if they're righteous, if they're good people. Marry them off as well. Meaning this concept of nikah and marriage is something which is so important. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala even encourages those, especially in those days who had slaves, to even marry the slaves off. Because it's something which is necessary or important in many cases. Not all the time, but in many cases it's something which is vital. Even if a person had a slave, don't neglect the slave who isn't married, marry them off as well. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala addresses something which sometimes we think of when we think of marrying our children off. And we think of finances. How are they going to support themselves? How are they going to support their families, etc., etc. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala continues in the hadith and He says, إِن يَكُونُوا فُقَرَاء يُغْنِهِمُ اللَّهُ مِنْ فَضْلِهِ. That if they're poor, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will enrich them through His bounties. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will enrich them, Allah will give them wealth. And in fact, the scholars, they say, one of the ways in which a person can increase in wealth, one of the ways in which a person can become richer, is by marrying. If anyone is finding it hard to earn a living, then you know what to do now. You can just get married and inshallah Allah Azza wa Jalla will provide for you. Of course there's conditions which we'll talk about. But the point is, this hadith, this ayah shows us Allah has promised. Allah has promised that those who are struggling and they wish to get married, that shouldn't be an obstacle in the way of a person marrying. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is encouraging us here to marry. Ibn Abbas radiallahu anhuma, he talked about this hadith, he said, رَغَّبَهُمُ اللَّهُ فِي التَّزْوِيجِ. That Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is strongly encouraging people to marry. In this ayah, Allah is strongly encouraging people to marry. وَأَمَرَ بِهِ الْأَحْرَارُ وَالْعَبِيدِ. And He's ordered it for those who are free and for the slaves. In this ayah, He's commanding it. And so, the concept of zawaj and the concept of marriage in Islam isn't something which one should take lightly. If we're responsible for children or others, then we need to understand it's something which is very important for a person's dunya and also for a person's akhirah. It could protect a person from the hellfire. It could be a reason why a person could enter hellfire if he doesn't end up getting married. And also the Messenger of Allah ﷺ, in a very well-known hadith, he talks about the importance of marriage. And accepting the proposal of somebody who comes for proposing for your daughter. He says, إِذَا خَطَبَ إِلَيْكُمْ مَنْ تَرْضَوْنَ دِينَهُ وَخُلُقَهُ. That if somebody comes to you and you're happy with his deen and you're happy with his character, with his akhlaq, فَزَوِّجُوا. Then marry your daughter after that. So he mentioned two conditions. He said, if you're happy with their deen and you're happy with their character, these two things, if you're happy with, then marry them off to that individual. And this shows us what's important from an Islamic perspective and what's considered to be of high value. Sometimes we think of what's valuable in a man. And of course, providing both individuals are consenting and they both want to marry, of course, because you can't force someone to marry, these two things are valuable in the sight of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Because if you think about it, a person's Islam, a person's deen, when he's a practicing Muslim, he's going to make sure that the rights of your daughter are fulfilled. That's the whole point. He's somebody who fears Allah. He's somebody who knows what he should and shouldn't be doing. He knows what's required of him as a husband in terms of marrying your daughter. And somebody with good akhlaq, good manners. And of course, akhlaq is part of Islam. Akhlaq is part of Iman. And so that's a sign that, if he has Iman, and he has his deen, and he has khuluq, and he has good character, then that's a sign that your daughter will, inshallah, by Allah's permission, be somebody who will get on with that individual. Because he's God-fearing, and he's also somebody who's known for his character. So he said, alayhi salatu wasalam, Zawiju, marry them off, if somebody like this approaches you. And then he talked about the consequences. What's going to happen? What would happen if a person doesn't? If a person refuses this kind of individual, he said, إِلَّا تَفْعَلُوهُ تَكُنْ فِتْنَةٌ فِي الْأَرْضِ. He said, if you don't do this, there's going to be temptation on earth. وَفَسَادٌ عَرِيضٌ. And there's going to be widespread corruption. Temptation on earth. How so? Because if somebody approaches you, the fact that he's approached you, asking for your daughter's hand in marriage, that in and of itself is a difficult thing to do. Maybe some of you have experience, going to your future father-in-law's house, back in those days. It's not something which is easy to do. You're nervous, you don't know how to behave, how to act, what do you do, what do you say. So for someone to come and approach and propose, ask for your daughter's hand in marriage, it's something which isn't easy to do. And if they're doing things properly in the Islamic manner, and they've approached you in the correct manner, and their deen is good and their akhlaq is good, and then they're still being refused, and the daughter wanted to marry that individual, and they wanted to marry her, and they're being refused, what does that mean for them? What does it show them? It shows them, hang on, the Islamic method isn't working. Because we did things by the book, we did things according to the Quran and the Sunnah, and things didn't work out. Things didn't happen the way we wanted them to happen. It didn't work. And so they think, well, that the only alternative is to go down another route. We'll take a boyfriend, take a girlfriend, we'll start having haram relationships outside of marriage. We'll just see each other without our parents knowing, etc., etc. All the usual things which end up happening. And so it ends up causing temptation on earth. Because even though they tried to do things the correct way, it didn't work out. And widespread corruption, what's going to happen? There's going to be corruption on earth. Why? Because of course they're going to have haram relationships. Maybe children will be born out of wedlock, etc. So you have so many issues, so much can come about, evil and bad things can come about as a result of a person simply refusing the hand of an individual who's proposed for your daughter without any specific reason. You rejected them, and this can cause something which is a lot worse than what you may have been fearing when you decided to reject them. We also look at some of the reasons why a person may decide to refuse an individual. You can tell me what some of those reasons may be, where they end up refusing a proposal by somebody. Anyone? What might some of those reasons be? Yes,
Is the person that hasn't got enough money?
Okay, yeah, money. So we mentioned money before, yeah. Financial. Education.
He's not practicing.
Yeah, we mentioned deen and khuluq. Let's say his khuluq and deen are fine.
Yeah.
Let's say he's practicing, he's good in character.
Okay.
Let's say he has money.
Caste. Different caste.
Okay. So caste.
The system for the resisting, like for making the color changes.
Okay, different race.
Different
Like African, Arab.
Arab.
Yeah. Okay, good. Yeah, so you have different background, different race. Different race, a different background, different caste, different tribe. So you might be from the same country, same town, back home, but it's a different caste, different tribe. It's just like, no, we can't marry that person. Speak the same language, look the same, etc., but it's still something which may be unacceptable. The person may have good akhlaq, he may be a practicing Muslim, but he's from a different race. So, a South Pakistani girl may want to marry somebody who's black or somebody who's white. And it's like, no, how can you do this? It's not something you should be doing. Even though Islamically, as we know, لا فرق بين عربي وعجمي إلا بالتقوى. There's no difference between the Arab and non-Arab except with taqwa. Taqwa is the standard which Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala holds high, regardless of which background you're from. It may be the person who's from the different race is better for your daughter than the one who's from your same family. I'm sure we've all seen cases of people marrying from the same tribe or same same kind of distant family, and even though they're marrying from people that we know or we thought that we knew them, the marriage ends up being a disaster. It doesn't work. Why doesn't it work? Because sometimes it's not always the case that just because you know somebody or he's from the same family as you, you're from the same place back home, that it's actually going to work. And sometimes I think we end up overlooking certain things, such as who our daughter is as an individual, who our son is, and what he's like, what's best for him, whether or not they're compatible, and whether or not they're not compatible. And sometimes we think of other things. I know of a case where an individual, a sister, she was forced to marry somebody from back home, her cousin from Pakistan, and she didn't want to. And so she was working, and so one day she went to work, and the parents received a phone call from her, and she said, I've met somebody at work, a white man, non-Muslim, and I'm going to stay with him, I'm not going back home anymore. Out of the blue. And just basically all of a sudden just left, didn't go back home ever again. because of those pressures, because of that stress and that pressure of having been forced to marry someone she didn't want to do. And she left Islam on top of that. She left Islam on top of that, obviously. She's thinking to herself, well, I've left my family, I've left my home, marrying a non-Muslim. From her perspective, she's thinking, maybe she wasn't as, practicing, obviously, of course, she wasn't, a practicing Muslimah, but she must have thought, well, that's it, like, I'm not Muslim anymore either now. Even though she was still a Muslim, but she willingly said, I'm not going to stay as a Muslim. Maybe she thought, I can't stay as a Muslim, how can I stay as a Muslim? Even though she could have. But from her perspective, she thought, well, I've left my family, I've married a white man, so now that's it. Khalas, it's the end of my Islam anyway. And so she left Islam. So these are cases which actually happen. And this is the consequence of sometimes not thinking about the interests of our children, but instead thinking of family politics, as they say. What this person may say, what that person may say. And the story doesn't end there. The younger daughter, there were three altogether, she was the oldest, by the way. And that's even more of a shock. Because when the oldest behaves that way, normally what happens with the other two? They follow. They'll think, yeah, well, she's the oldest, she knows best, and our parents are maybe backwards, they don't know what they're doing, so maybe she knows what she's doing. She's the oldest, we should follow her. But alhamdulillah, Allah saved them. And they realized what she did was wrong. So the next oldest, the previous daughter who left, she was supposed to marry her cousin in Pakistan. The father was obviously the brother. So there were two brothers, one was in England, the other one was in Pakistan, and he was going to marry his brother's daughter. He was going to marry off his daughter to his brother's son in Pakistan. I hope that makes sense. So the next daughter, the father's brother in Pakistan said, now you owe me one. Yeah, look how this all worked now. He said, you owe me one, this is embarrassing for me. Like, she was supposed to marry, etc., and then now she's gone, she disappeared. It's embarrassing for me. Again, they're thinking about themselves and their reputation. So he said, you owe me one, your next daughter has to marry my son, the next son. So they went to Pakistan, the two daughters went, and the other siblings, and the younger daughter, she said to the older daughter, don't get married. If you don't want to marry, don't get married. She didn't want to marry. And so the older daughter said, my father's heart was broken anyway, with the older daughter leaving Islam and leaving home. I don't want to do the same thing. And so out of obedience and love for her father, she ended up marrying. And alhamdulillah, they're still married. They have children and everything, so they're happy. But the point is, look at the knock-on effect. Look at just from a lack of maybe tarbiyah, a lack of education, a lack of thinking about the cares and concerns of one's children. Look at all the fitna, all the problems which arise. Fitnatun fil ardi wa fasadun arid. Temptation on earth and corruption. This is what happens. This is the consequence. And so it's not something. I'm sure we all have stories. We all have stories of cases where things haven't worked out as a result of family politics or the person's background or the person's race, the person's status in society. He's not wealthy, doesn't have lots of money, he's poor, how is he going to take care of you, etc. Even though both parties may be willing. And the scholars, they say, no doubt, a person's status in society may make a difference. It may be something which one should consider. Like, for example, a woman who comes from a house where the family are millionaires, and a man who's cleaning the streets, if they both got married, that marriage most of the time is going to be a nightmare for the man. He's going to be like, I bought you a present. And she'll open it, it's like a Mars bar. And she's going to think, what's this? Like, a Mars bar as a gift? What kind of joke is this? Where's my diamond ring? And he's going to think, this is a lot of money for me. Like, I don't want that much. And she's thinking, what do you think this is? Joke, like, I should be getting diamond rings and all this kind of stuff. And so, of course, sometimes these kinds of things may have to be considered during marriage. A person's status, how much money they're making, whether or not they're going to be compatible in that sense. That's an extreme example, but you understand the point that sometimes these kinds of things can make a difference. So that's one thing. Another thing, as as we mentioned from the example of this story, is forced marriages. And we know that the Messenger of Allah he said, لا تنكح البكر حتى تستأذن. That the virgin shouldn't be married until her permission is sought. Meaning a person can't force someone to marry they don't want to marry. It's not something, and logically as well, it's only going to bring about problems. It's only going to cause problems, especially nowadays in this country. Maybe there was a time when it was fine. Yeah, they don't want to get married, but they'll be fine. Give them 6 months. Give them a year, they'll be okay. Once they have a baby, it'll work out. But it's not the same circumstances as maybe it was back in the day. And it may work out, but nowadays, the circumstances are such that, as I mentioned, it's so easy for a person to have a relationship with somebody else and commit zina, etc. It's not worth their while. They're not going to make as much effort. Divorce cases are so much higher than they used to be. People divorce over silly things. And so, you have to take all the necessary measures to ensure, to the best of your ability, that two individuals who you feel are compatible will and should get married. And hopefully that they'll live peacefully together and in tranquility. That's not always going to happen though. Of course, sometimes you can make your best judgment and you can figure out which two people should get married, or who should marry your daughter, or who should marry your son, and you do your best, and sometimes things still don't work out, but you still have to do your due diligence. And as I mentioned, another obstacle or another reason for a person leaving Islam is marriage. As I mentioned the example, a person could end up leaving Islam because they think I can't marry such and such a person, or they think maybe I've proposed and I followed the Islamic protocol with regards to marriage, and it's still not happening for me. That they end up just leaving Islam, thinking that Islam is a problem, whereas it's not Islam, it's actually the culture, it's the background. It's the customs of a specific background where the parents are from, and they start thinking that it's Islamic, whereas it's something else. Another reason, and this is a lot more common in Arab countries, maybe in other parts of the world as well, is the mahar. The dowry is like an extortionate amount, where the son may end up going into debt just paying the mahar to marry somebody. And it's a big problem in many parts of the Muslim world. We also have to remember, as Muslims, that the Messenger of Allah told us, كُلُّكُمْ رَاعٍ وَكُلُّكُمْ مَسْئُولٌ عَنْ رَعِيَّتِهِ, that all of you are shepherds, and you're all responsible for your flock. And from our flock, of course, are our children. And that responsibility, when they reach the right age, for us to find a suitable spouse for them is something which is incumbent upon us to do. And we have to make sure that we find the right individuals for our children so that they can marry the best possible person. Also, many of our children, they wish to get married in the correct manner, but we may be the obstacles. Like we're the obstacles getting in the way of them actually marrying. And I know of a case where a person wishes to marry, he wants to get married, he's told his family, by the way, if your child comes to you asking you that he wants to get married, or telling you he wants to get married, you have to take that seriously. That's from experience. To approach your parents, or a child to approach you, asking you or telling you they need to get married, that's a sign that you need to marry them off. Because if they've gone to that extent where they've come to you and they said, Mom, Dad, I need to get married, that's a sign that maybe if they don't get married, something dangerous is going to happen. They may end up committing haram. Because it's not an easy thing, it's not an everyday conversation. I mean, most families, maybe there are some exceptions, but most of the time we don't sit around and talk about marriage, and it's not like a common thing, it's almost like a taboo thing. You don't really talk about marriage and marrying somebody, and when they reach the age, you don't sit them down. It's something that's a bit awkward, between parents and children. So if a child comes and says that they need to get married, they want to get married, you have to take that seriously, you have to listen. There's a reason why they're saying it. Something's happened. Maybe they're afraid they're going to commit zina, or they're going to do something else haram. Maybe they've seen someone, maybe they feel like they're in a position where they need to get married, maybe they're in university. And of course, that's a whole different ballgame. When a person goes to university, especially if it's out of town and it's somewhere else, that brings about its own dangers. They're away from home, there's nobody there that they know, no family members or relatives or anything, and maybe they're not doing something haram in university. No one's watching, no one's around. And so the fact that they come to you then asking you that, can they get married or they need to get married, we have to take that seriously. It's a big step for them to make. And it's also something which shows their maturity. The fact that they came to you, the fact that they approached you, asking you and mentioning it, that's a sign. So I know somebody who wanted to get married, and the parents wanted him to get married from back home. And he didn't want to get married from back home. And so when he made that clear, they didn't make any efforts to find somebody for him to marry in this country. Why? And they delayed it. So literally he's still not married, his brother. So he was looking to get married from the age of 26 or something. 26, 25, 26. And he's still not married. He's maybe 20, he's 32 now. Still not married. Why? Because the parents aren't looking. Why aren't they looking? Who can tell me? Any ideas? Why do you think they're not looking? What's the plan? What are they hoping?
Give up eventually.
Eventually he'll give up, like it's been 6, 7, 8 years. I mean, how long can he stay single? He's not going to survive that long. And so eventually, he'll say, okay, fine, I'll just get married from back home and then we'll go. And of course they've been telling him it'll be so easy, we can go like next week, go next month. You can get married straight away, no issues, no problem. We'll sort everything out. But he's like, I don't want to get married from back home. I don't want to. Like, it's not something that I want to do. And so they're like, okay, well, there's nobody around here. We don't know how to find anyone. And they don't do anything. They don't make any effort. And so now he's stuck in he's between a rock and a hard place. He doesn't want to get married from there, but if he does get married from there, it's hard for him to find somebody. And his parents aren't really helpful. They're not really helping. And so it's difficult for him as well. And so we have to understand, again, as I mentioned, we have to take their best interest to heart. We have to think about what's best for our children, as opposed to what's best for us. As opposed to us thinking, maybe, they're going to leave home and they're not going to be with us anymore. I don't want that. I want them to stay here as long as possible. That's a selfish thing, because you're thinking more about yourself as opposed to the quality of life and the future of your children. And with regards to those of us who aren't married, from our perspective, then you have to think about other things. First of all, zina is never the answer. Zina is something which Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala warns us of. Not just of the act of zina, but even coming close to zina. Don't even come close. Anything which tempts you to commit zina, anything which encourages you to commit zina, even those things you should stay away from. Because anything which leads you to zina is something which is just as dangerous as zina itself. Allah says, وَلَا تَقْرَبُوا الزِّنَا. Don't even come close to zina. Don't even come close to it. Meaning any of the avenues which may lead you to the act of zina, don't even come close to those. Don't approach them. And this shows us the danger of zina. And the Messenger of Allah alayhi salatu wasalam, he told us about zina. And he said, لا يزني الزاني حين يزني وهو مؤمن. He said, no zani, no individual who commits zina, is a believer at the time when he's committing zina. So when a person is committing intimacy in a haram manner, at that moment in time, it's as if Allah removes all faith and all iman from that person's heart. He's not a believer anymore. Doesn't have any iman while he's committing that act. And that also shows us the dangers of zina in this world. It shows us how lethal and dangerous zina actually is. And the Messenger of Allah told us about the akhirah and about the punishments of the people of hellfire from those individuals who are committing zina. And when he went on his miraculous journey to the heavens, he saw punishments of hellfire. And he said in the hadith, he said, we proceeded and we came across something which looked like a tannoor, a huge baking oven, a huge pit. And he said there were naked men and women in this oven. And a flame would come out from the bottom, and every time it would touch them, they would scream. The men and women would start screaming. And he said, I asked the angel, who are these people? And the angel said, إِنَّهُمُ الزُّنَاتُ وَالزَّوَانِ. These are the male and female zina, people who committed zina. Those individuals who committed zina, from the males and females, this is them. This is their consequence in hellfire. This is their punishment. And so, some of us think, zina is just fine. Like, if you're both consenting, It's okay, no big deal. Like, you don't have to marry and this and that. No, look at the punishment in hellfire. It's a serious thing. Because one of the things which Islam came to enforce and protect was a person's honor. You know, the woman's honor. One of the things Islam came to protect was lineage, preserving one's lineage, knowing where you came from, who you are, what your background is, what your identity is as a Muslim and as a human being. And so Islam came to preserve and protect these things. And so we see from this the dangers of zina. Also, the Messenger of Allah ﷺ, he told us about some of those things that a person can do to protect himself from zina. He said, Ya ma'ashar al-shabab, O young people, man istata'a minkum al-ba'ata falyatazawwaj. He said, whoever from amongst you is able to, then let him marry. If you can marry, meaning if you're financially able, if you have enough money to support your wife and your wife's content, she's happy, she has no issues, you know, she doesn't want you to be like a millionaire. She says, you've got that much money, it's fine, we'll get married and inshallah we'll survive. You know, we'll deal with it. Allah will take care of us. And if you have that trust in Allah Azza wa Jal, and you're able to, physically and financially, then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will provide for you. The Messenger of Allah says, marry. If you're able to marry, then you should marry. فَإِنَّهُ أَغَضُّ لِلْبَصَرِ. Because it's something which lowers the gaze. It protects a person from his gaze. The Messenger of Allah, he said that the eyes are the things which cause a person to increase in his desires and lusts in a man. A man, when he sees something, okay, it's sahab min sihabi iblis. He said the eyesight is an arrow from the arrows of shaitan. Because when a man sees something which is haram, it increases that desire. When a person is married, he lowers the gaze because he's protecting himself and his private parts because he's got married. فَإِنَّهُ أَغَضُّ لِلْبَصَرِ. It helps lower the gaze. وَأَحْسَنُ لِلْفَرْجِ. And it protects his chastity. And then he said, وَمَنْ لَمْ يَسْتَطِعْ. Whoever isn't able to marry for whatever reason, فَعَلَيْهِ بِالصَّوْمِ. Then let him fast. فَإِنَّ لَهُ وِجَاء. Because fasting is something which diminishes the desire. It's something which weakens the desire. When you fast and you stay away from food and drink, and we shouldn't underestimate fasting, brothers and sisters. We shouldn't underestimate this weapon of fasting. When a person fasts, it protects you from haram. It protects you from your desires. Because not only are you stopping yourself from eating and drinking, but as a lack of food and drink in your body, due to a lack of food and drink in your body, your desires also become weaker. And then there's less chance of you committing haram. Because not only is your desire inside of you, in your heart, weakened, but your body is also weakened. And so that desire and that need, that haram need that you may be feeling, isn't as strong as if a person didn't marry. And in fact, they say it's the opposite. When a person eats more, it increases one's desires. It actually increases one's desires, whereas if a person cuts down and fasts, it actually protects him from anything which may be haram, protects him from desires. On top of also the other things that a person needs to do to protect himself, of course. We also need to remember that nikah is something which isn't hard. Sometimes we think nikah is so complicated, it's so hard, it's this and that, it's too hard for a person. I'll just go and find somebody myself and I won't tell my parents, etc. Nikah, subhanAllah, is very easy. In fact, the actual nikah, according to the Sharia, what's required, the moment where a person is married to somebody else, literally takes about 2 minutes. To marry two individuals off takes about 2 minutes. The Imam I'm sure you guys have heard it before. The Imam will do a khutbatul haja, and then he'll ask permission from the guardian whether or not he accepts the proposal of the man. And then if the man says yes, the person will say, do you accept? They both say yes, we accept. Class, that's it. The job's done. Those of you who are married, I'm sure you know. It's not hard. The verbal nikah is literally 2 minutes. 1 or 2 minutes. It's not long at all. The rest of it is just bells and whistles. It's just extra. The written contract is something, of course, which is required according to the country. That's something which is extra. In Islam, you need 2 witnesses. You need the mahar being agreed upon. Obviously, the 2 people need to be consenting. And you need a wali for the daughter, for the girl. And that's it. Those are the conditions of marriage. It's not necessarily the case that you have to have loads of money, or she or he has to be from a certain background, etc., etc. So the actual nikah, in fact, is something very easy. The rest of it, okay, the nikah, the walima, doesn't have to be extravagant. You don't have to hire out a huge hall, and you don't have to have a Ferrari or a limousine or a Rolls Royce or something. These are all extra things which, culturally, sometimes we're tempted to do. We think, oh, we have to have that. You don't have to have that. You can do the nikah in a hall, in your room, in your house, with 2 witnesses and an imam. Job done. As long as they're both consenting, as long as the guardian's there of the daughter, that's it. And the mahr is agreed upon, and you have the witnesses. It's all valid. It's all correct. So this shows us how simple nikah is. Allah hasn't made it difficult. And the whole point of the nikah being easy is that it's not difficult for people so that they don't end up committing zina. That's the whole point. But culturally, we think of so many things. We think of who am I going to invite? If you invite them, you have to invite them, and then it just becomes a headache about who to invite to the wedding. What food are we going to serve? What clothes are we going to wear? What car are we going to hire? And so there's arguments about all this kind of stuff, whereas all this stuff is just irrelevant. It's not absolutely necessary. Also, the Messenger of Allah ﷺ told us in a hadith, ثَلَاثَةٌ حَقٌّ عَلَى اللَّهِ عَوْنُهُ, that 3 individuals, it's the right of that individual that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will help them. And from those, النَّاكِحُ الَّذِي يُرِيدُ الْعَفَافِ, the one who wishes to marry in order to protect his or her chastity. The one who wants to marry to protect their chastity, to protect their private parts. They want to marry so that they don't end up committing haram. This individual, Allah has said, it's that individual's right that Allah will help them. Allah will aid you if you seek nikah, if you seek to marry somebody through the halal means and do it properly. Allah has promised, guaranteed that He's going to aid you, He's going to help you find someone and marry you off. If your intentions are sincere, if you're doing things for the right reason. And this shows us how Allah will facilitate it for you. It won't be something which is difficult. You take the necessary measures, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will deal with the rest. Also, sometimes, our own behavior and the way that we act sometimes prevents us from marrying. Maybe we go to our parents who want to get married, and our parents think, you're still waking up at 11, 12 o'clock in the afternoon, and we're making you breakfast, and we're changing your beds, and we're cleaning your clothes, and we're making all your food, you're not even going to work, and you want to get married. How are you responsible? How are you going to look after a family? How are you responsible? And so sometimes it's as a result of the maturity of ourselves that prevent us from marrying. People see that. If our parents are the ones seeing it, then other people will also see it. And also, most of the time, if not all the time, our parents will always have our best interests at heart. And so when they see the behavior of the child and they think, this son of mine, this daughter of mine is not ready. He's not ready, he's just acting like a child. He's still 12 years old. He's still messing around and not, going out playing football every day and just, not working and not being responsible, not paying the bills, not doing it. He doesn't have his own place, he doesn't have his own flat or a house or apartment. He's not doing it, he doesn't have his own car. We have to drop him off everywhere. If that's the case with you, then you have to think about how you're going to provide for a family, how you're going to be the one responsible if someone's responsible for you still in your 20s or 30s. And so we have to remember that a lack of maturity could also be the reason why maybe a person isn't getting married. Maybe it's that reason why your parents maybe aren't looking or maybe encouraging you to marry. Sometimes a person's afraid. They think they're going to be bogged down. This idea of being bogged down, no freedom anymore. You're going to be under the thumb when you get married, that's it. You can't go out with your friends anymore, whatever the case may be. And to be honest, this is something which shows a lack of responsibility. Of course, no doubt, the bond that one has with his spouse is something that is unlike any other bond. You're going to be so close to your spouse, closer to your spouse than with any other human being. Even your brothers and sisters you lived with for many, many years. That's a sign of the closeness of the husband and the wife. At the same time, you'll get moments of happiness. But of course, there's responsibilities. But somebody who is afraid of those responsibilities doesn't want to be bogged down. Again, it's a sign of immaturity. We look at people in the past, and they would marry. You look at some of the companions. They married when they were teenagers. 14, 15, 16 years old. And that developed them. It made them responsible. It made them more mature. Why do you think there were people who, from the companions, who at the age of 16, they were responsible for an army to fight the Romans? Why? Because in those days, 16-year-olds weren't considered to be children. They were men. And of course, marriage is one of those reasons. Because they were, forced to be in a situation where they had to be responsible, they had to be mature from a very young age. And Islamically, there is no adolescence. In Islam, there's no teenage years. You're a child, and then you develop into an adult. Once you're an adult, at the age of 12, 13, 14, whatever the case may be, depending on the child, you're an adult who now has to pray, has to fast in Ramadan, has to give zakah if you have that much money. It all becomes a responsibility. And so we have to understand that there's no, middle phase. In fact, the middle phase is what causes the problems. Because the adult, who's just become an adult, according to everybody else in society, is still a child. Whereas him, he feels like an adult. He's thinking like an adult. He's behaving like an adult. He wants to be an adult. But everyone around him is still calling him a child. You're still a child, you're still young, you don't know what you're doing. And that's why you have, the whole idea of teenagers. The way they behave and the way they act all angry and frustrated all the time. Well, of course they're going to act frustrated when no one's treating them like adults. And everyone's treating them like children when they're not children. There's no such thing as, being in between an adult and a child in Islam. And so, responsibility is something which is good. It's something which makes men out of boys. It's something which, of course, is vital for Muslim communities. We have to be responsible. We have to think of others. We have to be, individuals who are not just thinking about themselves, but thinking of the community, the family, the neighbors, friends, society as a whole. And that's as a result of being responsible and thinking of the consequences of their actions, knowing the rights and responsibilities of others, the wives, the children, etc., etc. We also have to think about the financial aspect. We've talked about it before. Sometimes we think, I don't think I have enough money. I think I'm going to need more money to provide for my wife. But if we really think about it, there's people in third world countries who are marrying with a fraction of the money that we have. And they're content. They're happy. People marrying in third world countries who don't have any issues. Allah provides for them. Allah takes care of them. Allah takes care of their needs. إِن يَكُونُ فُقَرَاءَ يُغْنِهِمُ اللَّهُ مِنْ فَضْلِهِ. If they're poor, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will give them wealth. Allah will take care of them. And so sometimes, not wanting to get married because we think we need to have £10,000 in the bank account or £20,000 in the bank account is something which maybe shaitan is whispering to us to prevent us to not get married. And sometimes those ideas maybe are long distant dreams, and we end up not marrying for many, many years as a result. And maybe we end up doing something haram instead because of this unnecessary delay. And as we mentioned, people are marrying with a fraction of the amount of money that we have. In fact, a man came to the Prophet ﷺ and wanted to marry. And so he said to him, ﷺ, go home and find something that you can marry with. He went and didn't find anything, came back and said, I have nothing on Messenger of Allah. Like, he's so poor, he has nothing in his house to use, to spend, to have, to get married. So he said, go back, اذهب فالتمس ولو خاتم من حديد. Go back and find something, even if it's a metal ring, an iron ring. Even if it's an iron ring, that's enough. You'll be fine. Just find something. And again, this shows us it's not a condition. Unless, of course, the wife is saying, no, you need to have, I want a rich person. I don't want to marry some poor guy. I want £20,000 in your account before you marry. I want mahar to be this much. That's a separate thing. But if the wife doesn't have any issues and she's willing to marry, even though you may not have that much money, and of course it's natural for a man to think that. He needs to provide. It's inside of a man. For him to think, yes, I need to provide for my spouse, I need to have the money, I need to be working, etc., etc. But research shows that if a woman was asked, would you be happy with a man earning less if that meant he spent more time with you, or would you prefer him to make more money for you? And she said no. Most women, they said no, I wouldn't care if he made less as long as he spent more time with me and with the family. So that shows us The priority for women isn't the money itself, most of the time. Then obviously there's going to be exceptions. But this shows us also how money isn't the be-all and end-all. And as we mentioned, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will provide for you if you're struggling and if you have money concerns. Also, as we mentioned from the conditions of a nikah, is that a woman shouldn't marry except with the consent of the guardian. La nikaha illa biwali. There is no nikah for the girl except by the permission of the wali of the guardian. And this works both ways, by the way. As we mentioned before, if a man refuses to marry off his daughter to somebody who has good deen and good akhlaq, he's going to suffer the consequences. But at the same time, the woman isn't allowed to marry except by the permission of her guardian. So there's a balance there. So he's responsible. That doesn't mean that he rejects everybody. And that doesn't also mean that, she marries whoever she wants. There's a fine line, there's a balance between the two, so that everyone's thoughts and interests are taken into consideration. Also, being disobedient to your parents isn't going to bring about any source of barakah or khair in your lives. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَاعْبُدُوا اللَّهَ وَلَا تُشْرِكُوا بِهِ شَيْئًا. Worship Allah, do not associate partners with Him. وَبِالْوَالِدَيْنِ إِحْسَانًا. And be good to your parents. Straight after Tawheed and obedience to Allah, Allah talks about obedience to parents. Like straight after. After obeying Allah, worshipping Allah, not associating partners with Him, Allah mentions being good and obedient and dutiful to your parents. That's the level of obedience one should have to his parents. The next thing after worshipping Allah is being obedient to your parents. Obviously with the exception of them telling you to do something which is haram. But that's something which many of us neglect. And then it's not going to bring about any source of khair. If we marry without the consent of our parents, without their blessing, it's not a case of haram and halal. It's a case of barakah and blessing in your life. And also the issue of kamat tadinu tudam. Whatever goes around comes around. Eventually you will suffer the consequences. There will be no barakah and blessing in your life. Distancing yourself from your family and from your parents isn't something which is going to bring about khair and good in your family. Regardless of the circumstances, regardless of the situation, regardless of what happened, it's not going to be something which is going to benefit you. And lastly, brothers and sisters, as I mentioned before, these are difficult times we're living in. It's a different time. And this is why wise men of the past, they would say, لا تربوا أبناءكم على ما أنتم عليه. Don't raise your children upon what you used to be upon. فقد ولدوا في زمان غير زمانكم. Because they are being born and they're born in a time period different to your time period. They're born in a different time. It's a different situation now, different circumstances, different challenges and obstacles. Maybe in our time things happened a certain way. We didn't do certain things. We didn't behave in a certain way. But the needs were different. The society was different. The challenges were different. And things are changing. And so we always have to remember the way we treat our children shouldn't be the way we were treated as children when we were younger by our parents. You have to be more flexible and you have to think about what's best, providing it's in the guidelines of Islam. Inshallah, we'll conclude here. And if there's any questions, then I'll do my best to answer them, inshallah.
You mentioned as parents you help your offspring to look for spouses. That applies to both, a son and a daughter. Or should the son encourage to look for himself?
So the brother's asking, guardians should help and look for a righteous spouse for their children. Can the son, for example, look for himself or someone he wants to marry? Yes. So a man can look, a son or daughter can look and find someone themselves for them to marry, providing it's within, of course, Islamic guidelines. There's nothing wrong with that. Any other questions?
Who can be a wali other than the father, for example, for a daughter?
So if the father's not alive, for example, it can be a brother, it can be an uncle. If not, then they say if there's nobody around for that girl who could be a source of a wali or a guardian for her, then it can be the imam of the local masjid.
Can the son also be?
Yeah.
now it's different time really, yeah. Now it's now this generation is different time. They now in the school they're teaching different behavior. Whether now in Europe, everywhere. But now my advice saying the Muslim people, they have to make, like you say, make it easy for to marry in the girl come to as their family. There is there's good lecture you do. The more the lectures, they make it for people how they make it this lecture will be bigger.
Yeah, definitely. The brothers talking about circumstances and situations, and the kinds of things they're teaching in schools nowadays. And this is another reason for us to be even more flexible when it comes to marriage, talking about marriage, discussing intimacy with our children. We don't want to give that kind of education to schools and public institutions for them to brainwash our children and give them certain ideas. And so it's something which is a sensitive topic, but if it's approached properly Islamically, of course, Wallahu la yastahi min al-haq. Allah isn't embarrassed of the truth. A person shouldn't be embarrassed or shy of discussing and learning about certain things which Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala himself talks about in the Quran. The Messenger of Allah talks about in a hadith. Scholars would write books about intimacy and these kinds of topics. So it's something which is vital for a person's future. Okay, inshallah we'll conclude here. Jazakumullah khair. Subhanakallah wa bihamdika ashhadu an la ilaha illa anta astaghfiruka wa atubu ilayk. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.